So welcome. Again, my name is Nikki Lefebvre. I'm the director of the Natick Historical Society. As many as you know, we were founded in 1870, and today we remain an independent nonprofit that receives no public funds. And we thrive on the support of our community members. So I want to extend my thanks to all of you who support us. Your contributions make programs like these possible. Thank you very much. And we are thrilled to have with us today Rachel Speyer Besancon, who's going to talk about some items that she's worked with during her time spent in the Founders Collection here at the Natick Historical Society. Rachel currently holds the Marg M Balcom Archival Fellowship, which honors former director, president of the board, and longtime volunteer of the Natick Historical Society, Marg M. Balcom. And I also want to take a moment to thank the private donors who made this fellowship possible. We're grateful to you and so happy we've been able to work with Rachel in this capacity. Before I formally introduce Rachel, I do want to highlight one of our upcoming programs. On this Wednesday, that's May 26th at 7 p.m., we'll be joined by Athena Pandolf of the Natick Center Natick Center Cultural District. And that event is part of our Meet Our Neighbors series, which shines a light on local organizations that have really shaped Natick as a community in the past, in the present, and will continue to do so in the future. The Natick Center Cultural District is the force behind so many of our favorite community events here in Natick, from Multicultural Day and Natick Nights to Art in Bloom and the Love 01760 project. So you won't want to miss hearing from Athena about how the Cultural District began and how it pursues all that it does to make Natick a great community. You can learn more about our events on our website. That's www.natickhistoricalsociety.org. Tonight, this afternoon, not yet. We're really delighted to have Rachel Speyer Besancon with us. Rachel is the Natick Historical Society's first recipient of the Marg M. Balcom Archival Fellowship. Beyond her work as an archival fellow, Rachel has also been serving as a research and collections intern at the NHS since October 2019, working in both the archives and in the museum. At the Historical Society, she has been especially enjoying researching 17th century Indigenous history in Natick and in the surrounding area. Before joining the NHS, Rachel graduated magna cum laude from Wellesley College, where she studied political science and astronomy. I see a power fist. This fall, we're very happy to share the news that Rachel will be starting a PhD in history at Boston College, where she will be studying post-1945 West Germany with a focus on Reconstruction, denazification, and generational memory of World War II. If all of that weren't enough, in her spare time, Rachel can be found watching Red Sox games, knitting sweaters, and trying out new baking recipes. And I will add on a quite personal note that it has been such a joy to work with Rachel during her time here at the NHS. She has brought so much from her skill sets and her passion for learning to her ability to accomplish just about anything she's been asked to do, and just being an all-around tremendous person to spend time with. So thank you, Rachel, and I look forward to hearing what you have to say today. And with that, we'll give you a warm but silent Zoom round of applause and turn it over to you, Rachel.
All right, well, thank you very much, Nikki, for the warm welcome, and hello, everybody. I'm gonna start by just sharing my screen, and we'll just get started. Let me go on present, there we go. So thank you all so much for coming today. I think this is gonna be really fun. I've been working with the Founders Collection on and off for almost a year now. And there's some really cool stuff in there. And so I'm really excited to get to share it with everybody. So let's get started. So a little bit about the fellowship. Nikki already introduced it, but the point of the fellowship is to offer archival training to the recipient. So that involves understanding document care as well as organization, and that the Historical Society has a range of objects in its collection and its archive, from sort of plain flat documents to rare books and manuscripts and photographs. My project worked primarily with the Founders Collection, which is primarily flat documents. And it was a pleasure getting to, find these wonderful pieces in there, which I'm going to share with you today. And I think there's some really fascinating stuff in here that I think everyone's going to get a kick out of. So a little bit about the Founders Collection and the process of going through these items. So the Founders Collection is this assortment of documents ranging from 1649 to 2008. So it's over 350 years of history. It's not all focused on Natick. A lot of it is, but there's stuff from South Carolina. There's something related to Sri Lanka. I mean, it's all over the place. And previously it had been organized into thematic folders in a cabinet, but there was no comprehensive inventory. So one of my big tasks was sort of just systematically going through everything that's in there, creating a comprehensive inventory and tracking all of this metadata. So, categorizing things into what type of document they were, writing down dates, names, places that are mentioned, noting the condition, and if there's, any clear, concerns about the document itself, rehousing it in a mylar, like polyethylene envelope to sort of keep it safe from any disintegrating pieces of paper, that kind of thing, marking its current location, and then just sort of giving a brief summary of what exactly this document is. And yes, there were almost 500 documents in this collection, and they varied dramatically. So this next slide, I'm a person that enjoys a little bit of numbers, and because this collection is so varied, I think this is sort of a nice way to get a sense of what is in there. So this graph on the left, the breakdown by century graph, you can see almost half of the documents in there are from the 19th century. That's when the Historical Society was founded. That's when a lot of the town was actually, the population was expanding drastically. So the town itself was developing a lot during this time. So it makes sense that a lot of the objects that are, or the documents that are in the collection are from this era. There's one from the 17th century, it's from 1649. The date and several unfamiliar names are legible, and beyond that, it is, completely illegible. So unfortunately, there's not much to be said about that document. It's from 1649, so it's 2 years before the establishment of the praying town. There's no indication it has anything to do with Natick. The names are very unfamiliar to me, and I've gotten to know a lot of Natick's founders' early names. And then there's one from the 21st century, it's from 2008, and it's a printed out email from the Morse Institute Library's reference department. It's a 4-page narrative about Natick's founding. But beyond that, things are pretty evenly split between the 18th and 20th century, about a fifth each. And then the categories. So you can see, I think you can see my cursor, these green sections, the sort of legal wills, court documents, land transfers, debt, and government. Almost a half of all of the documents that are in the collection are legal documents, which again makes sense, as that is something that tends to be written down. Those are going to be important documents, so people are going to take better care of them. They're going to have really clear, important information on it, so they're more likely to be kept and preserved and collected by the Historical Society. And so because that's such a large chunk of them, I did sort of a subcategory breakdown, so you can see what specifically kinds of legal documents are in there. And so you can see about a quarter of all the documents in here are specifically just land documents. So rights to land, sales of land, transfers of land between parties, that kind of thing. There's a small, tiny little smattering of entertainment-related documents, ticket stubs, programs for parties, that kind of thing, which I'm going to be highlighting today because they're particularly compelling pieces of Natick's history, in my opinion. There's some sales slips, which are basically receipts of, services owed, that kind of thing. Some newspapers are in this collection, although the Historical Society has many other newspapers outside of the Founders Collection, but there are a few in here, and I'll be showing you one example of one of the newspapers that's in the collection. And the other 184 don't really fall into any of these categories. A lot of that a lot of those are signatures and autographs. That was a really popular thing to collect for historical societies back in the day, of finding and like cutting out signatures of relatively famous people and sort of sticking them together scrapbook style on a sheet of paper. So we have a lot of those, but there's also letters, narratives and notes about Natick's history, that kind of thing, that have also been preserved over the years. So as you can see, wide range of topics, wide range of time periods. And so my task was sort of making sense of what was in there. And so today I'm gonna sort of show you some of the fun stuff that I found along the way. And because a quarter of these were land sale documents, I'm gonna start with this there. So these three documents, 1727 to 1754, they're pretty close in time period. However, this time period was a big moment of change in Natick. And these three documents, specifically, the change from the first to the next two, really help tell the story of how Natick changed from this small, entirely indigenous praying town into a more white English settlement over time, and the Indian proprietorship system, which I'm going to talk a little bit about. So the Indian proprietorship system was basically established to protect land from being sold off by individuals, and instead made it so that any sale of land in the town would be subject to sort of consensus building. So no piece of land could be sold off by one individual. Instead, they needed permission from all other residents to agree to be sold to that specific person for this specific amount of money. And that was a way of basically keeping the land that Natick was as one sort of cohesive unit, as a way of maintaining Indigenous authority over this land, as English speculators and landowners were trying to expand into the area and get into the land market. So in the 1710s, 20s, and 30s, that system was in place and pretty much doing its job. And that system was made by the residents. They were the ones that were advocating for this to sort of protect their land ownership rights. And so in 1727, you can see this one on the left. It's a sale of land in Natick belonging to Isaac Monaquasan, who was a Natick resident. He was Indigenous, to Thomas Quasamug and Thomas Ephraim Jr., who were also two Indigenous residents of Natick. So this is sales of land between various Natick residents. The land is not leaving Indigenous hands. By 1750, you see now Joseph Ephraim. So the Ephraim name shows up again. This is a big family name in Natick, another Indigenous man. He's selling his land now to Samuel Perry. And again, in 54, Benjamin Trey and John Ephraim, another Ephraim, is again selling their land to Samuel Perry. So by the 1740s, that consensus building had been consolidated, that power of who had say over who could sell what land, that had been consolidated to a smaller group of people. And so by the 1750s, there starts to be turnover, and white landowners, English owners, start buying up land in Natick. And this individual property law starts coming into play. So these three documents, which are some of the earliest ones actually relating to Natick specifically that are in the Founders Collection, give sort of, you can see that storyline progress from Indigenous ownership to English speculators starting to come in and owning the land in the town as well. So that's this first one. So this is one of the newspapers that came my way in the Founders Collection. It's from 1887. So this is decades before Prohibition, but the Woman's Voice was a temperance newspaper. It was written and printed by women in town, specifically in Natick. And there's stuff in here primarily about the temperance movement, but that also came with other, it's not, you can't see in this portion of the newspaper, but in other sections, there's stuff about sort of women's work in the area and how to run a household. It's meant to be sort of a newspaper for and by women. And during this time period, there was a question in town about opening up a rum shop downtown. And members of the temperance movement unsurprisingly, did not support that. And so they were telling people, tell your husbands not to vote for this, because of course they were not voters at the time. But there's one section in this that I found quite fascinating, which is here, the enforcement of the law in Natick. And you can see at the bottom, searches, defendant warrants, prosecutors, that's prosecutions. That's blown up here on the right. They did this sort of name and shame tactic of, they printed this police information, arrest and search information of various people in town, their names, as well as businesses, so individuals and businesses that had their property searched for contraband. And as you can see, in most cases, nothing was found, but there were quite a few where something was confiscated, and there were several prosecutions that came out of it. And this was on the front page of this newspaper. And you can see the temperance movement in Natick was a hard-fought battle, and even in 1887, so long before Prohibition had taken place. But there was this long-standing, decades-long movement advocating for Prohibition. So this was a rather interesting find to me. And also the sort of slogan for the newspaper, "For God and Home and Humanity." They're like taking their cause very, very seriously, which I thought was rather interesting. So there's other bits of sort of politics that are referenced in the Founders Collection. And in part, maybe I'm most drawn to those because I studied political science back in college, but I do think they're very interesting. So all three of these are from the 19th century. As I'd said, almost half of the documents are from the 19th century. So this one on the left is from 1882, and it's basically a get out the vote flyer. It was organized by the town's Republican town committee. And this was, being distributed to voters in town, all the men in town. And I found it interesting because the language in this felt really familiar to me to sort of the get out the vote efforts you see today. So, let it never be said that the state was lost because of the stay-at-home Republicans. This specifically was about the gubernatorial election in 1882. And the previous year, a Democrat had won, and there was concern he was going to be reelected. And a Mr. Bishop was running on the Republican Party ticket, and he lost again. So this flyer didn't even work. But this kind of language of, you got to get out the vote is so important. We definitely still hear today since 1882. So I thought that was quite interesting. This second is a message from 1875 relaying to the town of Natick, a Mr. Coolidge in Natick, that the current Vice President, Henry Wilson, who was known as the Natick Cobbler, he's one of Natick's many claims to fame. This was notifying someone in town that Mr. Wilson died at 7:20 a.m. So Mr. Wilson was a sort of beloved figure in Natick's history. The town was very, very proud to have any affiliation with him. He worked as a shoemaker in town for a long time before starting his political career. And so this telegram, or message from a telegram, was sort of turning this national storyline into this sort of small town's realization of one of their favorite political characters had unfortunately passed away. And Natick had a really large memorial celebration. I believe in our photographs collection, we might have a picture or two from that as well. There were big parades downtown, banners held in honor of Mr. Wilson. So that was an interesting find. And then the third on the right, you might not think of it as a Natick thing, but it is. So this is a letter from a man named Albert Smith. And he was from Natick. He lived in Natick, and he was writing this letter to his family that were still in Natick. He was sort of sowing his wild oats down south during Reconstruction. So this was sent from Tennessee. He also visited Kentucky and spent a lot of time sort of in Appalachia there. And this was a letter he wrote home to his family, sort of describing what he'd been seeing while he was traveling around the South, and a little bit about his interactions with some of the Tennessee residents that he was meeting. And two of the things that he said that quite stuck with me in terms of sort of politics during this time of Reconstruction is one, that it used to be the case that, they loved the term Yankee during the Revolutionary War, that, we're all Yankees, we're Americans. Now, of course, they hate that term. They despised the Yankee, because of course now that's the Union rather than specifically just Americans in general. And also he had quite a way with words. He says they would change the color of the sky if they could. They hated the blue from the Union uniforms during the Civil War. So he's sort of writing home to his family in Natick of, I'm having a great time here. The soil is great for farming. I'm learning all these things. I saw this bizarre he mentioned sort of in passing that he witnessed a murder, and they thought about fussing around for a trial briefly, but they couldn't get the lawyers to come at the right time. So, oh well. So he's very sort of blasé about some things in this, which was fascinating to read. But he is conveying how Reconstruction felt, especially as a Northerner down visiting, which was fascinating to me. And the Civil War was a really big part of Natick's history. A lot of Natick sons went and served. And so this pamphlet that is a printed speech that was delivered by one of the town ministers, Horatio Alger, upon the opening of Glenwood Cemetery in 1863. So this is the middle of the Civil War. And I'm gonna guess, because of the Civil War, there is need for a new cemetery in town. So this is the sort of opening of his address for the consecration. And the Glenwood Cemetery is actually not far from the Historical Society. It's in South Natick. And actually all of the Alger family are buried there. So the man that gave this address is now buried there as well. But the Civil War was a really important part of Natick's history, and there's quite a bit written about it. And this sort of, when I found this document, it was sort of, I've passed Glenwood Cemetery many, many times, and it sort of grounds that specific location in the time period that it was first established in, and the people that were living, and why they had to open up a new cemetery and that kind of thing. So there's some more somber documents in here as well. But enough of that, because there's some bizarre and truly fun documents in here. This was one of the very first documents I found just starting with Founders Collection, was this advertising pamphlet for a married circus duo from Vermont that would shoot themselves out of cannons, would blow up massive hot air balloons and jump out of the hot air balloons. They had these big explosions of different colors, fireworks and things. And this is I think it was either the first or maybe the second document I found. So when I first came across this, I thought, okay, the Founders Collection is going to be a wild ride. And it was. But so this duo, his name was Professor, I'm not sure if he was a professor, but he was referred to as Professor C.C. Clarence Clement Bonnet, and his wife, Minnie. And they were a traveling circus duo. And they, in this, it's a multi-page pamphlet that includes testimony from people who've seen them. They write about, we're always on time. We always bring a second balloon. So if one rips, it's no problem. We have a second. We're good workers. We'll, you'll be astounded by our acrobats and things like that. But this bottom right, the smaller print, so they emphasized how dangerous their acts are, in part because in 1897 in Malone, New York, he writes, his wife, Minnie, she fell 25 feet onto some rocks and damaged her spine. She had jumped out of a hot air balloon, and she became paralyzed from this horribly dangerous act that they were doing and had been doing for 10 years. And she continued to perform with him after that. So he writes, she's the only lady on earth who can properly superintend the filling of a balloon. So even after getting paralyzed from these death-defying acts, she continued touring with her husband. They were, continuing to take on New England by storm. And they're aeronauts, which again, maybe that's interesting to me as an astronomy person, but this circus act from 1901 was a bizarre find. I have no idea if they performed in Natick, but somehow their advertising pamphlet went to the Natick Historical Society, and boy, am I glad, because it was really fun to read through their testimonies of how wonderful their performance is. So that was an exciting find. Another set of entertainment-related objects that were in here. So this is actually 3 documents, the striped red, white, and blue, and the large image on the right. It's a front and back. But I'm going to start with the bottom left. So this is a ticket to a 1921 ticket to the 35th annual concert and ball for the Natick Firemen's Relief Association. And you can see actually the sort of cutouts on the side. To me, it feels sort of 1921s of that that aesthetic of sort of the cutouts and these sort of geometric lines and things like that. And this ticket is rather interesting to me because it says, this ticket admits 1 gent and 2 ladies for $1, and it's an additional 35 cents for each additional lady. So evidently there would probably have been more women at this ball than men. And I guess preserving that ratio is very important to them because 1 ticket's only for 1 man. But it gives you a sense of sort of the fun leisure activities that were in town in the 1920s. To the right of that one, the Centennial Hobnob, this is from 1876. It's in honor of the country's 100th birthday. And you can see it says at Bartlett's Hall, admit 1 Old Town Folks at Home. And that's in reference to Harriet Beecher Stowe's novel, Old Town Folks, which is, if you've, you could walk through Natick and someone will tell you about Old Town Folks. She's most well known for Uncle Tom's Cabin, but in Natick, it feels that she's more well known for Old Town Folks, which was a novel she wrote based off of her husband's memories of Natick. So her husband grew up in Natick and would reminisce about his time, his life in Natick. And she wrote them down into a book and changed, place and character names. But this was a sort of beloved, and still is a beloved reference to Natick's importance of, this big author wrote a story about us. If any of you have been to the South Natick Dam, that little island is called Holyoke Island, which is named after one of the characters in Old Town Folks. There's a house, the Stowe House, which is across the street from the museum. And the plaque says the Harriet Beecher Stowe House. However, she never lived there. It's her husband. It's the Stowe House. It's his childhood home. But her book was very influential to sort of Natick's history and is a big part of pride. And then this last document here is from 1900. And it's a front and back, the red, white, and blue party and dance at Oddfellows Hall in Natick, Mass. If any of you watched Bridgerton, you might be familiar with a dance card. That's what this is. But basically, women would bring this tiny little card with them to parties, and there'd be a list of the dances that were going to be performed. And men would come up and initial or sign which dance they would be dancing with the lady. And so evidently this woman was quite popular. I mean, perhaps she arrived late and missed the first 3 dances. And after that, she had a partner for almost every single one. Good for her. But you can see what dances they were doing. And I don't know, when I found that, I thought that was quite quaint. And I also hadn't realized that they were still being used in 1900. I think of them as sort of like a Jane Austen type era, but apparently not. They're still being used in 1900 in Natick. So that was a kind of cool find. And the last slide, before I change it for the last slide, just the last document series that I'm going to share with you all, I want to say that this next one is by far my favorite story that I uncovered working with the Founders Collection documents. Just from the sheer absurdity of it, and it's a rather chaotic story and bizarre, but I found it really compelling. And the sort of main character in the story is very much that, a character. He seems this sort of larger than life, bizarre, strange man. But the photograph that you're going to see in the next image actually is not from the Founders Collection. It is from the Needham History Center. However, they sent it to us when we had first emailed them asking for more details about this when we first found out about the story. And I had to include it in this presentation, and you'll see why, because it is a very strange picture when you first see it, but it helps tell the story of this estate. So the Baker estate was this really large, it's sometimes referred to as Ridge Hill Farms. It was this massive estate that sort of straddled the line, the border between Needham and Wellesley. And it belonged to a millionaire named William Emerson Baker. And he'd made millions in the sewing machine industry. And he was this very strange fellow who loved sort of developing more projects on his estate. He had a grotto, he had this big menagerie of animals. He really liked collecting sort of exotic animals and dangerous large animals. And he had this big boathouse that was lined with paintings of famous movie stars of the era, and like theater stars and that kind of thing. Bizarre man. And so in 1874, there was a retired circus bear up for sale, and his name was Billy Bruin. And so William Emerson Baker bought this large retired circus bear to add it to his bear den, because as any millionaire has for their estate, he had a bear den. He had previously tried to buy 2 bear cubs, but unfortunately in transportation to his estate, both bear cubs died. So he was so excited to get Billy Bruin, who was this massive bear from the circus. However, Mr. Baker had horrible luck in getting his bears to his estate, because so the bears made it from South Station to Wellesley train station on the train. However, Billy Bruin escaped from the Wellesley train station while changing custody, and he ran off into the woods, and Mr. Baker was terribly distraught. He really wanted to find Billy Bruin, his name was already Billy Bruin from his circus performing days. So he was really distraught. He wanted to find him, so he organized search parties. And for a week, they were searching for Billy Bruin. They could not find him until, unfortunately, they eventually found him, and he had drowned in a river. And so Mr. Baker was horribly distraught. And in honor of Billy Bruin, he threw him this massive funeral on this estate. So this photograph is from that funeral in 1874. I could not tell you for the life of me why these people are dressed up that way. However, I know there were some very strange requests and rules for the funeral. Among them was that each guest write a poem to honor Billy Bruin and recite it for everyone at the funeral. There was also a request that there was this parade procession that you can see here. And also Billy Bruin was buried in this massive $10,000, which is, 1874, $10,000 copper coffin, and was wrapped in this large, luxurious velvet shroud. Only the best for retired circus bear Billy Bruin. And there was this large parade procession. And in this photograph, you can see a swan on the carriage here, this large swan. And in this top right, this is an invitation to the swan's funeral. These are related. So this invitation doesn't look very compelling because it's just a lot of text, but basically this is a long narrative explaining how poor Leander the swan died while attending Billy Bruin's funeral. So the unfortunate death of this retired circus bear eventually led to the death of Leander the swan. So during the funeral of Billy Bruin, Leander the swan had meandered into the Arboretum pond, as any estate has. He had an arboretum. And inside that pond, he had Herod the alligator. Again, of course, you have alligators on your estate in Massachusetts. So Leander, unfortunately, had not noticed that Herod was there. And Herod the alligator, unfortunately, killed Leander the swan. And so, very distraught that his swan had been killed, Mr. Baker organized a second funeral only about a month later in August for Leander the swan. Again, invited people from all over, international guests as well, to honor dear Leander the swan. And you can see at the bottom it says children specially invited, which I just think is hilarious. Although I guess it makes sense of appreciating the animal kingdom and all of those things. And so the image below that is sort of the backside of the swan's funeral invitation. And that was addressed to a Mr. Joshua Parmenter in South Natick. So you can see Natick residents. The estate was not part of Natick's history, but Natick residents would have been attending his parties, including Mr. Parmenter. And these certainly weren't the only parties that Mr. Baker was throwing. So the bottom right is the program of proceedings for the opening of a piggery. It's a big pig pen on the estate. And one fun fact I learned about that, this was in 1875, a year later, that Mr. Baker had tricked the Massachusetts governor into attending this and doing the dedication of the pig pen. So he requested that the governor come to the estate, and I guess when you're a millionaire, you can sort of convince your governor to come visit you at any time. So the governor came by, uncertain of what exactly his purpose was at the estate. And when he arrived, there were people all over. He was like, well, what's going on? What am I here for? And Mr. Baker told him, oh, well, I want you to do the dedication for my pig pen. It's going to be opening, and I would like you to be in charge of that. So this large pig pen was dedicated by the Massachusetts governor at the time, which is incredible. And so all of these things were, not specific to Natick's history. It's part of, surrounding towns, but it's gives a sense of some of the parties and leisure activities Natick residents could have been up to in the 19th century. It's also very funny to me because he really strikes me as sort of a Gatsby character of throwing these opulent, extravagant parties, but it's very much not the 1920s. This is 10 years after the Civil War. I don't know, I really got a kick out of finding these documents about the Baker estate. And it was by far my favorite thing that I found. Nikki, whenever I find sort of bizarre objects, I'm like, oh, Nikki, you've got to see this. You've got to hear about this. So she knows, she's familiar with this one. But yeah, so that is sort of the end of some of the highlights. There's many others in there, other great ones. But this photograph is a panoramic shot of downtown. It's not from the Founders Collection. I just thought might be a nice thing to look at while we chat. But this is of downtown, and you can see the railroad line, and sort of just a shout out that the Founders Collection is not the only collection in the Natick Historical Society archives, many, many others. And there's some really fascinating stuff in there. And so once COVID is over, and things are sort of safe to open up again, we love having visitors to the archives to show what cool stuff is in there. So, all right, well, that's all. Thank you all very much. And I'll send it back to Nikki for any questions that people might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. That was wonderful, and such a fun and interesting glimpse at what's in the Founders Collection.